Have you ever met someone who carried a secret so heavy it became their entire life? This is the story of Colonel Helen Graves, a woman forged in the fire of combat but forgotten by the very institution she served. At 68, she's not a hero with medals, but an old woman in grease-stained coveralls, her weathered hands meticulously restoring an old fighter jet in a dusty hangar. To most, she's just war cosplay grandma. But to a handful of men and the ghost of a mission officially erased from history, she is the reason they are alive today. Her silence has been a monument to their survival. But what happens when the truth she's so carefully guarded finally starts to surface? Colonel Helen Graves had long stopped counting the years, though 68 seemed to weigh heavily on her back these days. But here, in the heart of the hangar, time meant little. She wiped the grease from her hands as the mechanical whir of the tools buzzed around her. There, beneath the flickering lights of Hangar 7, she stood beside the weather-beaten F-86 Sabre. Its tail displayed the faded emblem of a golden eagle adorned with 4 stars, a mark of past glory. This aircraft, a relic of history, had once been her savior, the tool that had carried her and her unit through some of the most dangerous skies of their lives. But now it was just an old piece of scrap, rusting quietly away under her careful hands. No one helped her, and no one thanked her. She didn't expect it, of course. She never had. But she didn't mind. This was her domain, her sanctuary. At least it used to be, until the tires screeched from outside. The sudden noise broke the stillness of the hangar like a storm crashing against a lonely shore. 5 military jeeps tore into the yard and skidded to a halt in front of the entrance. The vehicles stopped with an abruptness that left dust swirling in their wake. Doors slammed open, and the harsh clink of boots hitting the concrete reverberated throughout the quiet space. A voice rang out. "Ma'am, step away from the aircraft." Helen didn't flinch. She didn't look up either. Not at first. She didn't need to. She knew they were military. She could hear the tension in the voice of the officer who spoke, his tone sharp, demanding. A salutation followed, a formality that felt foreign in this place. But it was clear enough. These men were here for something. What did they expect to find in the F-86? "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice low but steady, almost daring them to explain their intrusion. The hangar had long been forgotten by the military. The base itself sat at the edge of the town, an afterthought in the annals of military history. The airfield had been left to decay, slowly being reclaimed by the earth and the elements. But not by Helen. She had stayed behind, tending to the relics of a time long past. At 68, she lived alone. Her home was a small, converted office space next to the hangar, the furnishings sparse, just enough to get by. Her days were structured in rigid routine. Wake up with the dawn, sip her black coffee, then devote herself for the next 8 hours to restoring the F-86, painstakingly peeling away years of rust and corrosion. She knew every inch of the aircraft as well as she knew herself. The aircraft had once saved her entire unit, and in a way, it had become her second skin. She worked on it with the precision of someone who understood the price of survival. The work was slow, but that didn't bother her. Some wounds, after all, took time to heal. The hangar was dim and dusty, a place that might have seemed dreary to anyone else. But to Helen, it felt like home, a sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the comfort of mechanics and metal, where the world outside couldn't touch her. But today, the peace was shattered. She could hear the soft shuffle of 2 young engineers as they wandered through the open doors of the hangar, their shiny shoes and pressed shirts clashing with the worn-down surroundings. They had come just like she knew they would, the property developers. "This would make an excellent mixed-use commercial space," the taller engineer remarked casually, his voice loud enough for Helen to hear, not bothering to hide his distaste for the junk littering the area. Helen didn't acknowledge him, her focus fixed on the F-86 as she tightened a bolt on its wing panel. She had no time for his kind of talk. Her hands moved deftly, working without pause. "Is that a real Sabre?" the second engineer asked, pointing to the aircraft. His tone was less dismissive, but still laced with the same sense of superiority. "If you're lucky," Helen replied without looking up. She added almost to herself, "Neither will you when you're 70. The engineers exchanged glances. For a moment, they stood there, unsure how to proceed, clearly unaware of the depth of the history they were standing on. They approached her cautiously like someone encountering a stray dog, uncertain whether to pet it or keep their distance. "Ma'am, are you authorized to be here?" the first engineer asked, eyeing the grease stains on her coveralls as if they were some sort of disqualifying mark. "More authorized than you," Helen shot back, her hands still moving, never missing a beat. The second engineer smirked. "This property has been rezoned for commercial development," he said, almost as if explaining a fact to a child. "The military abandoned it years ago." "They abandoned a lot of things," Helen muttered under her breath, but didn't look up to meet his gaze. Unperturbed, the first engineer stepped closer, his gaze now focused on the F-86 as though seeing it for the first time. "Her time is over," he said to his colleague, voice dripping with the arrogance of youth. "Just an old lady with some scrap metal now." Helen paused for a split second, her hands faltering, but only for a heartbeat. She had heard worse. She had lived through worse. These men, they didn't know anything about sacrifice. They didn't understand the weight of history or the value of what they considered junk. She continued her work, not acknowledging them, not even sparing them another thought. Without a word, she climbed the ladder that led to the cockpit, her movements deliberate, as if she were more a part of the aircraft than the woman who had restored it. The engineers, unsure of what to do next, wandered further into the hangar, lost in their own discussions about square footage and renovation possibilities. They spoke as if the air around them was nothing more than a blueprint, their voices echoing through the empty space, unintelligible to anyone who had once known the importance of silence. Inside the cockpit, Helen wiped down a small, almost invisible metal badge on the instrument panel. It was an insignia, the mark of an Air Force colonel. Beneath it was etched, Operation Diamond Wing, a classified mission so deeply buried by the government after the war that no one remembered it. She traced her fingers over the engraving, the memory flooding back in an instant, sharper than the polished surface in front of her. Diamond Wing, a mission that had saved 17 lives, but cost her career, her recognition, her place in history. A mission that the world had decided never happened. With care, she returned the badge to its place, a silent tribute to a sacrifice no one would ever acknowledge. A shadow passed over the entrance, drawing Helen's gaze. She looked up to see a figure standing just outside, watching. A man wearing a faded military jacket. He stood apart from the others, his posture rigid and controlled, with an air of someone who understood how to remain unseen while surveying everything around him. He was Special Forces, no doubt. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she felt the weight of his gaze. He wasn't like the engineers. This man carried the weight of experience, of battles fought and lost, of secrets buried deep beneath layers of time. It was a look that Helen recognized all too well. Colonel Helen Graves stood still, her gaze fixed on the aircraft. The sound of distant voices echoed around the hangar, but her attention was riveted to the fighter jet she had been restoring for years. The scene in front of her was one of focused sequence, with her hands still in the air, mid-repair. Yet her mind was far away, reliving the mission that had defined her, an operation that no one would ever truly understand. A figure appeared in the corner of her eye, walking with slow determination. He wasn't looking at her directly. Instead, his eyes were locked onto the aircraft she had been laboring over, studying it with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. The man was tall, wiry, and graying at the temples, his posture stiff, almost military. The way he carried himself reminded her of someone who had seen too much, someone who had lived through too many wars and battles. As his gaze lingered, Helen's instincts kicked in. She could feel something off about this man, a presence that demanded her attention. But before she could even say a word, the man turned abruptly and walked away, as if suddenly realizing he had overstayed his welcome. He didn't speak, didn't offer an explanation. He simply vanished into the distance, leaving a trail of unanswered questions in his wake. Who was he? What was his interest in this obsolete fighter jet? Was there more to this man than he was letting on? Why had he been watching her so intently? Her thoughts spun with these questions as she took a deep breath, momentarily losing herself in the quiet hum of the hangar. There was something unsettling about that encounter, but she had learned long ago not to dwell on strangers, especially not in the confines of this hangar, where the past had a way of creeping in like smoke in the shadows. The past that had followed her for decades, never truly letting her go. Kuwait, 1991. The night sky was alive with the sharp crackle of anti-aircraft fire as Captain Helen Graves fought to stay steady in the cockpit of her F-86 Sabre. She was in the middle of Operation Diamond Wing, an extraction mission that had quickly fallen apart. Intelligence had been wrong, the enemy was more prepared than anticipated, and everything had gone sideways. But none of that mattered as Helen's voice crackled through the radio, steady despite the chaos around her. Talon team, this is Diamond 1. Hold position. I'm coming in hot. Beneath her, in a ravine that seemed to swallow all light, 17 men, wounded, exhausted, but alive, huddled together. They were trapped, and the enemy was closing in. The sound of the enemy's fire echoed through the valley, sharp and menacing. Helen's aircraft dove low, taking a barrage of enemy fire, drawing it away from the men on the ground. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one had asked her to come. She had gone against orders, knowing full well what was at stake. In '91, a woman commanding an all-male combat squadron was a rarity, a dangerous anomaly in the eyes of the military. But in the air, with missiles screaming past her canopy and tracers lighting up the dark sky, all those old barriers seemed like distant memories. Gender politics? They seemed irrelevant, insignificant in that moment. What mattered was survival, and that was a line Helen was willing to cross. She made 7 dangerous passes, flying low enough to draw enemy fire away from the extraction point. The aircraft was taking heavy damage, but she kept flying. The mission wasn't going according to plan, and neither was her career. But none of that mattered. Not then. What mattered was the men she was saving, and as long as there was breath in her body, she would fight for them. When the last man was safely extracted, Helen's Sabre was battered beyond recognition, its systems failing, one engine sputtering, its hull riddled with holes. She nursed it back to base on sheer will, her fingers gripping the controls as though they were the only things tethering her to the earth. It was a miracle that she made it back at all. Back on the ground, the men she had saved were questioned, debriefed, sworn to secrecy. The mission, now classified, was buried, and so was Helen's role in it. She was called before a military board and reprimanded for insubordination and protocol violations. Her actions were considered reckless, even dangerous. But the truth was, the men she had saved would never be able to tell anyone that it was her who had brought them home. She was quietly passed over for promotion and gently nudged toward early retirement. The handshake she received was colder than she had anticipated, and the request for discretion was a slap in the face. There was no public acknowledgement, no fanfare, no salute. She was left to fade into the background, her service never fully recognized. And so, the truth remained locked away in classified files, hidden from the public eye. 30 years later, her life had narrowed to the confines of Hangar 7, a solitary space where she continued to restore the aircraft that had once carried her through that unacknowledged mission. The actual plane from that night was long gone, decommissioned, dismantled, and forgotten. This replacement, a mere shadow of the real thing, was her connection to the past, a physical manifestation of something that had been lost to time. It was the one thing that kept her grounded, a reminder that she had been there, that she had done something important, even if no one else ever knew. The morning after the engineer's visit, Helen arrived at the hangar to find an eviction notice taped to the door. Unauthorized aircraft storage removal required within 48 hours. Beneath the typed text, someone had scrawled something in bold marker. "War's over, Grandma." Helen stood frozen for a moment, staring at the words. The notice was an inconvenience, nothing more. But the scrawled message, some kind of cruel, thoughtless taunt, pierced through her like an icy wind. With practiced precision, she peeled the notice from the door, folding it neatly along the creases before slipping it into her pocket. She had faced far worse in her career. Military investigations, enemy fire, and the indifference of institutions that had once claimed to value her service. All of it had failed to break her. But this attack from faceless strangers, from people who didn't even know her name, didn't faze her in the way it should have. Helen wasn't worried about the trolls or the ridicule. It was the aircraft that worried her. If she were forced to relocate, she had nowhere to take it. She had poured years of her life into this restoration, and it was almost complete. Walking away now would feel like a second erasure of everything she had done. She couldn't let it go. She wouldn't. As she turned back to the aircraft, reconnecting hydraulic lines in the landing gear, the sound of an approaching truck broke her concentration. A sudden tension ran through her as she straightened up, preparing for more officials or developers. Instead, an elderly man in a worn denim jacket appeared, walking toward her with hesitant steps. His gait was slow, cautious, as though unsure of his welcome. "Colonel Graves?" he asked, his voice rough, like it had been unused for far too long. Colonel Helen Graves had never expected her past to come knocking, especially not in the form of an old man with a package wrapped in brown paper. The man stood at a distance, his posture formal but respectful. "I apologize for the interruption," and he said, his voice steady but slightly uncertain. "Marine Master Sergeant James Decker, retired. I served with Force Recon during Desert Storm." Helen didn't lift her eyes from the workbench, where her hands were busy with the tools in front of her. The words Force Recon made her pause. She hadn't heard that name in years, not since the desert and the battles that came with it. She allowed herself a moment of curiosity before finally looking up, her gaze locking with his. "Forcon Force Reconnaissance," she murmured, feeling a twinge of recognition. "Elite Marines, possibly one of the 17. Her mind briefly wandered to the names and faces of the men she had fought alongside, some of whom never made it back. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart rate quickened. Decker shifted his weight, his expression turning serious. "Actually, ma'am, I'm here to correct an old mistake." He extended the package toward her, wrapped carefully but worn at the edges. "This was misdirected 30 years ago. I've been trying to find you ever since I came across it in a military effects auction about 15 years ago." Helen blinked, a wave of confusion sweeping over her. "You've been trying to find me?" she asked, incredulous. She took the package from him with caution, wiping her hands on a rag before touching it. The package was light, about the size of a thick book. The outer wrapping looked old and faded, but beneath it, an official Pentagon envelope was visible. It was sealed with a bold "Top Secret" stamped in black across its center. "How did you find me?" she asked, turning the envelope over in her hands, her mind racing. Decker seemed uncomfortable as he spoke, his voice soft. "That video, the one going around? My grandson showed it to me. Said people were making fun of some old lady with a fighter jet. I recognized the aircraft. Then I recognized you." Helen's heart skipped a beat. The video, she had seen it too. It had gone viral, some grainy footage of her, long past her prime, still holding on to a piece of her history. She hadn't been prepared for the ridicule it brought. Her grip tightened around the envelope, the weight of time pressing down on her. "I see," she murmured, processing the collision of the past and the present. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind, and now here it was, barging into her quiet life with an internet meme, and a stranger who had, in some strange way, brought it all back. "People don't know the whole story," Decker said quietly, his tone almost apologetic. "But they will. What's true, ma'am, can still be true." With that, he gave her a crisp salute, one she hadn't received in decades. The sound of his boots faded as he left, leaving her alone with the package. For a long moment, Helen stood still, staring at the envelope in her hands. There was something hauntingly familiar about it, something that pulled at the threads of a past she had buried. She wondered if the revelations inside it would bring her any peace, or if they would simply serve to reopen old wounds. Some scars don't bleed, she thought, but they still hurt. They ache for years, lingering like a dull throb deep in the bones. She thought about those scars, about the people who carried them silently, without ever sharing the weight. Did they ever get the chance to let go, or did they carry them alone forever? The sun hadn't yet risen the next morning when Helen made her way to the hangar. The sealed envelope was still tucked away in her jacket pocket, and the weight of it hung heavily on her chest. She had spent the night awake, turning it over in her mind, torn between the desire to open it and the fear of what might resurface. Curiosity gnawed at her, but the idea of revisiting a past long buried filled her with dread. She had work to do today. The task was simple enough, though emotionally taxing. Removing the starboard wing from the Sabre, the aircraft she had once flown, the first step in dismantling it for forced relocation. As she worked, each bolt she loosened felt like a personal defeat. It wasn't just the plane, it was the years, the memories, the pieces of her identity that had become intertwined with it. Her movements were precise, her hands steady, but the heaviness in her chest was undeniable. She felt as though each twist of the wrench was a final concession, a surrender to forces she could not control. By 9 o'clock a.m., when the property manager arrived, clipboard in hand, two security guards flanking him like silent sentinels. "Colonel Graves," he called, though the title sounded more like a taunt than a form of respect. "Your grace period ends today." Helen didn't respond immediately. Her focus remained on the stubborn bolt she was working on, trying to ignore the sinking feeling that started to settle in her gut. "This is an official eviction," the manager continued, his voice rising with authority. "This aircraft is unregistered junk, occupying commercial property." Helen finally looked up, her face a mask of calm. "I have until tomorrow," she said evenly. "Plans have changed." The manager sneered, his eyes flicking to the two guards as though they were part of his personal entourage. "The developers are coming today for final measurements," he said. "You don't have time for your little projects." Helen wiped her hands on a rag, then turned to face him fully. "I need more time," she said, her voice firm but quiet, "to prepare the aircraft for transport." The manager smirked, clearly enjoying the power he wielded over her. "Transport?" he repeated. "To where exactly?" "No museum wants this relic." "Colonel, this thing's headed for scrap metal." The words hit harder than she wanted to admit. Scrap metal. It wasn't just a machine, it was a piece of history. Her history. It was the one link she had left to the past that had been methodically erased over time, piece by piece. Having it torn apart, reduced to nothing but scrap, was unbearable. The manager stepped closer, his presence pressing down on her. "I've seen that video," he sneered. "War cosplay grandma. Quite the internet celebrity now." Helen's grip tightened on the wrench in her hand, but she didn't let his words get to her. 30 years ago, she had faced enemy fire without flinching. Now she would not flinch at petty cruelty. A small crowd had gathered outside the hangar, drawn by the viral video. Some had phones out, recording. Others whispered to one another, pointing and laughing. It was like watching a public execution in slow motion, the modern equivalent of a public flogging. Helen turned back to the aircraft, her back straight, her eyes steady on the work ahead. She refused to let them see her break. The sound of engines approached in the distance, the low hum of military vehicles cutting through the morning air. The developers, no doubt. But in that moment, it wasn't the developers she heard. It was the echoes of her past, coming back to haunt her. The rumble of engines approached fast. 5 olive-drab jeeps came around the corner, roaring at speed, their tires skidding over the dusty road as they formed a flawless V formation before coming to a synchronized stop just outside the hangar. Each vehicle was marked with military plates and insignia, many of which Helen didn't immediately recognize. The property manager, a man who'd clearly expected to have the upper hand, watched with a faltering, confused expression. What the hell was happening? The doors of the jeeps opened at once, and men in dress uniforms stepped out. Their posture was perfect, each movement synchronized, as though they were one single entity. At the front of the convoy, a lieutenant colonel emerged, his chest heavy with combat ribbons. Without sparing a glance for anyone else, he marched straight toward Helen, saluted with precision, and spoke in a voice that carried through the air with authority. "Colonel Graves," he said, his tone crisp and formal. "Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, Special Activities Division. I need to speak with you urgently." The property manager, recovering from his surprise, stepped forward, trying to assert some authority. "Excuse me, but this is private property," he said, voice shaky but demanding. Without missing a beat, Matthews turned to him, and with just a look that could freeze a flame, he silenced him in an instant. "Sir, I suggest you step back," Matthews said, his words cutting and final. "This is now a matter of national security." The crowd that had gathered outside had grown still, phones recording, but the sense of uncertainty in the air was palpable. No one quite knew what they were witnessing, the gravity of it making everyone tense. Matthews turned back to Helen, pulling out a sealed folder with unmistakable classified markings. "Ma'am, I believe you received a package yesterday from Sergeant Decker," he continued, his voice steady. Helen nodded, her hand instinctively reaching into her pocket. Have you opened it? Matthews asked, the question almost cautious. No, she replied, her voice low but controlled. She could feel her heart starting to race. Something was happening, something she couldn't yet understand. Matthews seemed to exhale in relief, then proceeded, Then I need to provide some context first. He broke the seal on the folder, removing an official-looking document. This is a presidential order declassifying Operation Diamond Wing, effective as of 0600 this morning. Helen's breath hitched at the mention of Operation Diamond Wing. Her mind raced, trying to keep up. Matthews continued, his words relentless. Operation Diamond Wing, declassified after 30 years of silence. And Colonel, this, he held out a document, is your long-delayed Medal of Valor citation. Your security clearance has been reinstated at black level, effective immediately, to facilitate your full debriefing and public recognition. Her fingers froze around the edges of the document as Matthews handed it to her, a piece of history that had been buried, suppressed for far too long. This was the citation that Decker had delivered, the one that had been sitting in her pocket unopened, like a dormant weight. This is the original citation that was suppressed, Matthews explained, his voice tinged with both pride and regret. Sergeant Decker recovered it when military archives were being digitized. He's been working with us for years now to correct this historical oversight. Helen's eyes darted back to the property manager, whose face had gone pale, his earlier confidence vanished. The security guards, too, seemed uneasy, subtly stepping back. The atmosphere had shifted from confusion to something much heavier. With a steady hand, Helen tore open the envelope that had been delivered by Decker. Inside, beyond just the Medal of Valor citation, was a personal letter from her former commanding general, dated 91, recommending her for the honor, a recommendation that had been buried by higher authorities until now. Why now? Helen asked, her voice steady, despite the swell of emotions threatening to break through. Her eyes were glued to the letter, her mind trying to piece it all together. The last member of the oversight committee that buried your accomplishment died last month, Matthews explained, his voice quieter now, almost somber. His sealed testimony included a confession about Operation Diamond Wing, as well as the deliberate suppression of your role in it. As they spoke, the sound of more vehicles pulling up filled the air. News vans, some of them emblazoned with logos Helen recognized, had been drawn in by the mysterious military presence in the crowd's growing social media posts. The same digital ecosystem that had mocked her only hours before was now documenting her vindication, capturing every moment for the world to see. One reporter, the same one who had run a segment earlier on the so-called delusional hangar lady, approached cautiously, microphone in hand. Colonel Graves, she asked, voice tentative but urgent, could we get an exclusive statement about what's happening here? Before Helen could respond, more military personnel arrived and swiftly secured the perimeter of the hangar. Among them were men much older than the typical active-duty soldiers. They were in their 50s and 60s, but their movements, their posture, their presence, they carried the unmistakable bearing of special operators. Despite their age, one of them stepped forward and introduced himself simply as Richards. Ma'am, Richards said, his voice rough but sincere, I was the team leader that night in Kuwait. I've waited 30 years to thank you properly. He turned to the other men, and in perfect unison, they formed a line. Present arms, he called, and as one, the 17 surviving members of that operation raised their hands in salute. These weren't just any veterans. Colonel Helen Graves had never sought the spotlight, and yet here she stood amidst a crowd that only a few months ago would have scarcely acknowledged her existence. The same crowd, now awed and humbled by the truth she had carried for so long in silence. For decades, her contribution to the mission that would come to be known as Operation Diamond Wing was buried, classified, and forgotten by history. But today, history had found its voice, and it would no longer be silenced. The members of her team, elite operators who had long carried the weight of their clandestine missions, had gathered to honor the truth that had been hidden for so many years. The youngest among them, a man with children and grandchildren now, stepped forward after saluting Helen. His voice was steady but thick with emotion as he addressed the crowd. Ma'am, he began, most of us have children now, even grandchildren. We're only alive because of you. He gestured to the F-86 Sabre beside them. This isn't the exact aircraft you flew that night. It was deliberately scrapped to erase the evidence of what you did. But this model saved our commanding officer's life. The property manager, who had been filming the moment, stepped back, his camera forgotten, as he grasped the magnitude of the revelation unfolding before him. The crowd, initially gathered for what they thought would be a simple ceremony, now stood in solemn silence. They were witnessing a rare and powerful moment, one where buried truths were being brought to light. Helen stood at attention, her back straight beside the aircraft she had painstakingly restored. It wasn't just a machine to her anymore. It was a living testament to a past she had kept secret for so long, now finally visible for all to see. This was no longer just about her history. It was about acknowledging the untold stories of countless others who had served without recognition. The F-86 Sabre had become a symbol not just of the mission, but of the quiet, uncelebrated valor that had often gone unnoticed. Months of painstaking effort had transformed the abandoned hangar into a temporary museum exhibit. As the Air Force Academy prepared a permanent home for the F-86 Sabre and the newly declassified Operation Diamond Wing archives. Helen stood before the crowd at the academy, her dress and uniform pressed and pristine, despite having been locked away for decades. The Medal of Valor gleamed against the rich blue fabric of her uniform, no less meaningful for the years that had passed since its award. General Wilson, the Air Force Academy commander, stepped forward to make an announcement. Colonel Graves will be joining our faculty as an honorary advisor to the history department, he said, his voice carrying over the hushed room. Her first-hand knowledge of Operation Diamond Wing will assure that future officers understand the significance of that mission and the importance of recognizing valor, regardless of gender or political convenience. The audience responded with applause, a spontaneous and heartfelt gesture. Military personnel, cadets, and civilians, all united in respect and admiration, shared a collective moment of recognition that felt almost surreal after so many years of silence. Among the crowd sat Richards and his team, many of them having traveled from Kuwait and beyond just to witness this moment. It was a reunion of sorts, a reunion not just of friends and comrades, but of the mission itself, a mission that had been buried for far too long. Helen approached the podium, her discomfort with attention evident, but her resolve unwavering. This moment was not about her. It was about something far greater. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady but emotional as she spoke. This aircraft represents more than one mission, she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. It stands for all the operations that were conducted without recognition, for all the service members who completed their duty without acknowledgement. She gestured to the F-86 Sabre, now gleaming under the lights. This particular aircraft wasn't even the one I flew that night. That one was deliberately scrapped to erase the evidence. But the restoration of this aircraft became my way of preserving a truth that I wasn't allowed to speak. The plaque beside the aircraft read simply, "Silent Warrior, Survivor from the Shadows." It was a small tribute, but a powerful one, a final acknowledgement of the service and sacrifice that had been kept in the dark for so long. After the ceremony, visitors filed through to examine the aircraft. A young girl, no older than 12, approached Helen, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Ma'am," she asked, her voice soft but eager, "did people really look down on you once?" Helen took a moment to consider the question. She glanced at the girl's mother, whose embarrassed expression betrayed her discomfort with the subject. But Helen was unbothered. She had faced far worse than a simple question from a child. She smiled gently. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "People did look down on me once. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't require anyone's permission to exist." The girl nodded, clearly processing the weight of Helen's words. Her gaze was thoughtful, mature beyond her years. Helen watched her for a moment longer, then turned back to the crowd, her thoughts momentarily drifting back to those long years of silence. Later that week, Helen initiated a new tradition at the academy. Her old, weathered pilot's helmet, the one she had worn during Operation Diamond Wing, was placed in a display case, a tribute to the past and to all those who had served in the shadows. Each year, it would be awarded temporarily to the top graduating female cadet in recognition of excellence. "This isn't about me," Helen told the first recipient, a sharp-eyed lieutenant with promising evaluations. "It's about ensuring no one else serves in silence." The young woman accepted the honor with visible emotion, her eyes brimming with gratitude and respect. As Helen turned to leave, the lieutenant hesitated for a moment before speaking. "How did you endure being forgotten, ma'am?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Helen smiled, the expression holding decades of experience and quiet strength. "I wasn't forgotten by the people who mattered," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I wasn't forgotten by the men who came home." Helen Graves stood quietly in the museum, gazing at the restored F-86 Sabre, her eyes tracing the sleek contours of the aircraft. It had been a long journey both for the plane and for her. As she watched cadets immersed in their studies of the aircraft's systems, she couldn't help but feel a sense of completion, as though the past, once lost and buried, was now reconnected with the present and stretching out into the future. The very same aircraft that had once been a symbol of her erased history now stood as a living testament to truth, her truth. It was no longer just about restoring a piece of military equipment. It was about restoring the narrative of what had truly happened all those years ago. This was a story that had been lost to time, erased by powerful forces, but now it would be carried forward, no longer relegated to shadows. For 3 decades, Helen had fought to keep the aircraft intact, preserving the memory of a mission she had executed with precision and courage, yet had been forced to forget. The day the restoration was complete, she realized it wasn't just the aircraft that had been brought back to life. It was the truth itself, a truth that would outlast the silence that had plagued her for so long. 2 years passed in quiet reflection before the moment came that would change everything. Mackenzie Chen, a young historian with a fresh perspective, uploaded a video titled "The Forgotten Colonel: How Helen Graves Rewrote Aviation History." It started with the now infamous war cosplay grandma clip, a piece of footage that had once gone viral for its odd juxtaposition of military history and popular culture. But from there, the video delved deeper, unveiling declassified mission footage, interviews with former Special Forces team members, and a meticulous timeline of events. Mackenzie narrated, "Sometimes history isn't what we're told. Sometimes it's what was deliberately hidden." In the following minutes, the video traced Helen's rise, the classified missions she had led, and the systematic erasure of her accomplishments by those in power who sought to bury uncomfortable truths for political convenience. The narrative expanded beyond Helen's story, revealing similar patterns of omissions for others who had served in secret wars, whose deeds had been hidden not just from the public eye, but from history itself. Within 3 days, the video had surpassed 3 million views. The comment section was flooded with veterans who shared their own experiences of overlooked and unacknowledged service, with family members recounting the stories of loved ones who had died without recognition for their own classified operations. Active duty service members voiced their struggles with a system that still struggled to recognize service in the era of shadow wars and covert operations. In a follow-up video, Mackenzie interviewed Helen herself, now a respected figure at the academy, her office adorned with photographs of the 17 men she had saved during that fateful mission, their families growing as time passed. "Do you feel bitter about the decades of silence?" Mackenzie asked, her voice gentle, yet probing. Helen, now seated in her office, sunlight filtering through the windows and catching the silver in her hair, took a moment before answering. "Bitterness is a luxury I never allowed myself," she said quietly. "If I'd focused on what was denied, rather than what I had accomplished, I would have lost twice. I didn't want to give them that." The camera cut to the Academy Museum, where the F-86 Sabre had now been placed at the center of a new exhibit. Helen moved slowly around the aircraft, her hand brushing the surface with a tenderness born of years of longing and silent resistance. This wasn't just about restoring an aircraft, she explained. It was about preserving the evidence that what happened, that the mission mattered. Official records might fail to capture the truth, but the plane itself, it holds the proof. She paused beside the cockpit, looking at it as if seeing the entire span of her life reflected in its polished surface. When history tries to erase you, creating tangible reminders becomes an act of resistance. The final shot of the video was set against a brilliant sunset that bathed the museum in a warm amber glow. Helen sat on the wing of the aircraft, wearing reading glasses and a simple Academy sweatshirt. a far cry from the decorated combat pilot she once was. In this moment, she was more like a retired professor, at peace with her journey, her battles finally laid to rest. Her expression spoke of an unspoken peace, a reconciliation with both the past and the present. Mackenzie's voice rang out over the final scene. There are heroes who don't need recognition, but the world needs to know they exist. The video ended with a close-up of Helen, her eyes peeking over her book, sunglasses reflecting the golden sunlight. She looked up, catching the camera's gaze for a brief, almost imperceptible moment. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Then she returned to her reading, a woman who had finally come to terms with both the weight and the release of her past. The comments flooded in one after another. My grandfather never talked about Vietnam. After he died, we found medals we never knew he earned. Another read, as a female service member, this hits hard. We're still fighting for recognition. One particularly poignant comment simply stated, just found out my aunt was part of a classified Gulf War operation she never told anyone. The video sparked a wave of similar stories, each one a testament to the forgotten heroes of history, the unsung warriors whose stories had long remained hidden in the shadows. Helen Graves had given them all voice, even if it was long after the battle had been won. Helen Graves had always considered herself an ordinary person, someone who had simply done her duty. But as time passed, the truth began to emerge. The people whose lives she'd saved, whose sacrifices she'd helped immortalize, those stories were finally being heard, decades later. The veil of silence that had shielded them was slowly lifting. Her story, once buried in the shadows of classified operations, had opened a door for others to follow. The recognition wasn't just for her anymore. It was for all the unsung heroes who had never received the acknowledgement they deserved. Mackenzie Chen, a young and ambitious military historian, became a key player in ensuring that those stories would never be forgotten. Her career was propelled by the viral video she created, shining a light on overlooked military contributions. She had been the one to piece together the fragmented histories, the ones too often left in the dark. And even as her professional success soared, Mackenzie kept in touch with Helen. She consulted her regularly, seeking insights and anecdotes for a book she was writing about the invisible sacrifices made by service members. One afternoon, as Mackenzie sat in Helen's modest study, the two of them sifting through old papers and photographs, Helen shared something deeply personal, a thought that had stayed with her for years but never made it into the broader narrative. This most important recognition isn't medals or public accolades, Helen said, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet wisdom. It's knowing that the children and grandchildren of those 17 men are alive today. Lives that wouldn't have existed if that mission had failed. That, Mackenzie, is the real legacy. It was a powerful moment, one that didn't need the camera or the spotlight to shine. Helen's words spoke volumes about the quiet, enduring impact of service, how sometimes the true reward isn't visible to the public eye. And it wasn't just about the men she had fought beside. It was about their families, their futures, and the lives that would go on because of their actions. Helen's role at the academy had evolved over the years. As she neared the end of her career, she saw an opportunity to leave behind something more than just stories. She wanted to ensure that future generations of military leaders understood the true cost of secrecy, the weight of moral decisions that were often hidden behind layers of red tape. And so she established an ethics course, one that would delve into the complex and often murky world of classified operations and the consequences they carried. The syllabus was built around real-life case studies of service members whose accomplishments had been buried for political reasons, operations and missions that were deemed too sensitive or inconvenient to acknowledge at the time. The students, many of them soon-to-be officers, would study the lives of these unsung heroes, grappling with the ethical dilemmas that came with such hidden histories. They would learn not only the technical aspects of warfare, but the human toll of decisions made in the name of national security. In the heart of the classroom, a simple yet profound motto hung on the wall: don't judge someone for their silence. Sometimes they're the reason you still have the freedom to speak. Helen knew that the path to understanding the true cost of war was not through glorified victories or medals, but through the quiet, unacknowledged actions of those who had been forgotten by history. It was her final gift to the military community, A legacy not of fame, but of knowledge, understanding, and moral clarity. As the years passed, the course became a cornerstone of the academy, a place where future leaders could reflect on the complexities of the world they would one day command. And for Mackenzie, the book she had written, drawing from Helen's wisdom and the untold stories of countless others, became a way to ensure that their sacrifices were never lost again. Her work was more than just history. It was a way to preserve the honor of those who had been left in the shadows. And at the end of it all, Mackenzie's final message, a call to action that resonated deeply with anyone who listened, still echoed. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in honor. And don't forget to subscribe, because silence deserves a voice. Helen's legacy would live on, not in the fame of her name, but in the quiet acknowledgement of all those who had given their lives, their futures, and their families for something far greater than themselves.